A new study indicates that men do not understand that their women want to bone just as much as they do. This is research that was done by 2 different Canadian universities, and I think it's really interesting because it talks about the stereotypes that women have to deal with when it comes to their own sexuality and how those stereotypes impact their own relationships and how often they have sex with their partners. So research subjects were aged 18 to 68 in this study, and they had been in their current relationships for an average of 6 years. They reported having sex about 1 to 2 times per week. The members of the couples either visited the lab once to report on their general sexual desire, their perception of their partner's sexual desire, and their satisfaction with their relationship, or kept a daily 3-week diary on those same 3 factors. Some also reported on their daily level of motivation to evade sexual rejection. So here's the amazing outcome of these studies, okay? On a regular basis, men significantly underperceived the degree of their female partner's sexual desire, while women consistently made accurate judgments about how much their male partners wanted sex. Among diary-keeping couples, on days when men underestimated their female partner's libido, the women actually showed higher levels of relationship satisfaction.
So I want to pause there because there's a couple things to dissect here. I love that last part. They're like, oh, you thought I didn't want to have sex. Boy, I am so much more satisfied today.
I really don't understand that disconnect. It's very weird.
Okay, no, well, I mean, it might be partly because they're like, okay, I don't have to have sex today. Great, I'm more satisfied.
Yeah.
Which then leads you to believe that maybe the guys weren't that far off to begin with based on their assumptions.
Yeah.
But of course, the researchers also have another answer, which is when guys think that the woman is not necessarily in the mood for sex, they try to get her in the mood by acting right. And then that increases the satisfaction of the wives. Like, oh, okay, he took out the garbage, he was attentive, we watched something, TV show together, whatever it is, right? And so their satisfaction goes up because he's trying to get some. Okay, and he thinks she's not necessarily going to be receptive. And then it was interesting that women totally made accurate judgments on males' desire to have sex, which was often and and repeatedly, right? And so, you know, part of it is the stereotype, and it might not necessarily match, but when it comes to the males, no, the stereotype matches. They know exactly, the women know exactly how many times you want to have sex. Partly because men are not good at hiding it.
Well,
you know, like, oh, what? Me want to have sex.
So
me go now.
Gender communication is an interesting thing because men and women communicate in very different ways, which is a source of a lot of conflict in relationships. Men are very straightforward. They don't pick up well on nonverbal cues, right? Women are better at picking up on nonverbal cues. I remember learning about this in a gender communications class, and I thought it was fascinating, and it made a lot of sense. Another big difference between men and women is, you know, women sometimes talk about their problems just because they want to talk about their problems and vent. Men want to find solutions. So when you're a woman just trying to vent and a guy's throwing solutions your way that you don't necessarily want, it becomes frustrating, and that's another source of conflict. Anyway, super interesting stuff. But the thing that I do want to talk about a little bit is how many women out there are actually just devastated by how unsatisfied they are in their sex lives, in their marriage, in their relationships, whatever, and how alone they feel, because the public's perception is that most women don't want sex and that their men are always hounding them for it, right? And so for the women who really want to have more sex and their partner isn't giving them as much as they want, well, then they feel like there's something wrong with them, right? Like, but I don't get it. All these guys are always like bugging their women about having sex. They always want to have sex. Why is it that my partner isn't always trying to have sex with me? Why is it that I want it more than he does? But it's actually very common.
So, well, the other thing that was mentioned in here was, I don't often see in studies either, and I'm really glad that they touched on it because it made me go, oh yeah, that's interesting, right? The daily, what you mentioned there, the daily level of motivation to evade sexual rejection.
Yeah.
So men get to a point, apparently some significant percentage of them do, where they think, well, I don't want to ask again, and she says no again. So I guess she doesn't want it, so I'm not going to ask. So that's an interesting factor as well. And so when you get all of that built into one, well, that's where you have the miscommunication and the frustration. So some of the things that you mentioned there are generalizations, of course, but they're generalizations because they're largely true, but they're not true to every man and every woman. So some guys are very good at picking up visual cues.
Yeah.
And sometimes, men understand what women want, etc.
Yeah.
But sometimes women don't understand, hey, if I reject the guy over and over again, and then he's going to ask me less, right?
Yeah,
they don't see it from each other's perspectives.
By the way, I think that goes both ways. I think that there are cases where a woman might feel rejected and then she's afraid to go for it again, and that could be, look, the best thing that you can do is have open and clear conversations with your partner about what you want, what you think is lacking. That's the only way to improve it. If you're playing guessing games or you're afraid of, rejection, so you're evading it, it's going to lead to more problems, right? And I think a lot of couples are coping with the fact that they're not sexually satisfied, both the men and women. And part of the reason why is because of that lack of communication.
Everybody looks at things from their own perspective. And for men and women, sometimes it's very different. So men think, well, if I want sex, I just say it, right? Or it's super obvious. So why don't they just say it, right? But that's not necessarily how women see it, or they're not turned on by the idea of going, me want sex, right? And that's not necessarily how they're going to react. So just step into each other's shoes for a second, and it'll improve things tremendously. And the final note's a funny one. They asked men also when they're single, and when they're single, they overestimate the women's desire to have sex. Like when they go to a bar, they're like, oh yeah, she wants it, definitely. It turns out, no, not exactly. So we need to learn how to calibrate a little bit better.
Agreed.